At 10 a.m. Eastern Time, the United States Navy began enforcing a blockade in the Strait of Hormuz. That sounds like the whole story. It is not. The real story is that when the line went live, Chinese ships were already inside the strait, not approaching it, not debating whether to enter inside. That is the first image you need in your mind if you want to understand what happened this morning. American warships drawing an enforcement corridor across the most important energy choke point on Earth, and Chinese commercial vessels already past the gate, already in the water, already part of the equation before the blockade truly began. That single image tells you almost everything, because once Chinese ships are already inside the strait, this stops being a clean pressure move on Iran. It becomes something much more dangerous. It becomes a test of whether America can impose control after another major power has already entered the space. And that is a very different kind of crisis. Most people hear the word blockade and imagine something simple, a line, a barrier, a gate that closes, but Hormuz does not work like that at its narrowest point. The strait is only about 33 kilometers wide, and roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply moves through that corridor on a normal day. You do not need to build a wall across it to control it. You only need to make passage feel dangerous enough, uncertain enough, expensive enough that ship owners, insurers, traders, and governments begin adjusting their behavior around fear. That is how Iran used Hormuz when the war began. It did not need to stop every vessel physically. It needed to create a condition where the water itself felt unstable. Mines in the water, warning fire, missiles nearby, insurance risk exploding, captains hesitating, routes changing, prices climbing. Now America is trying to do the reverse. It is saying the strait can open for the world, but now on Iran-as terms and not through Iranian control. It is saying that any ship entering or leaving Iranian ports can now be stopped, inspected, delayed, or seized on paper. That sounds like a move against Iran in reality, because Chinese ships were already inside the strait. It instantly became a move with China sitting in the middle of it. That is the true story. Not that America announced a blockade. That America announced a blockade after Chinese ships were already inside the gate. And once that happened, Washington stepped into what I would call the inside gate problem. The inside gate problem is simple. If you start a blockade before the rival power is in the water, you are setting rules. If you start it after the rival power is already inside, every option carries a political cost you cannot avoid. If America stops Chinese ships, this becomes a visible confrontation with China, not just Iran. If America lets those ships pass, the blockade looks selective, porous, and weak in the first hours of its life. If America tries to enforce the line inconsistently, the result is not stability, it is uncertainty. And uncertainty in Hormuz is its own form of escalation. That is why this moment matters so much, because the question is no longer just what Iran will do. The question is what America can credibly do now that China is already part of the scene, to see how dangerous that is. You need to understand what Iran was doing before this blockade. Iran did not close Hormuz equally for everyone. That distinction matters more than most coverage will admit. For weeks, the strait was effectively closed to America, Israel, and Western allies in any reliable sense. But Iran still allowed pass for countries it considered either useful, neutral, or strategically important: China, Russia, India, Iraq, Pakistan. That arrangement did not happen by accident. Iran was making a political map out of a maritime choke point. It was saying, in effect, this waterway is not only a commercial artery, it is now a filter. Friends, buyers, and useful neutrals may pass adversaries will face danger, delay, or denial. China benefited from that arrangement. While Western traffic was squeezed, China kept moving cargo, oil, and strategic value through a corridor Iran still partly controlled. And that means that when America declared its blockade, it was not interrupting a hypothetical Chinese interest. It was interrupting an operating Chinese pattern. That is why the Chinese ships already inside the strait matter so much. They proved that when Washington acted, Beijing was not outside watching. Beijing was already embedded in the traffic reality of Hormuz. That changes the geometry of the whole crisis, and the timing makes it even worse because only hours earlier, there had been a diplomatic path still barely alive. In Islamabad, negotiations had reportedly come close to some kind of understanding. Not a final peace, not full trust, but enough of a framework that people directly involved were still talking like a document was within reach. Then the terms shifted. Iranian officials accused the American side of maximalism and moving the goalposts. The talks broke down. And almost immediately, the answer was not a slower, broader diplomatic process. The answer was escalation by blockade. That sequence matters because it tells everyone watching that Washington looked at a failed negotiation, looked at a crowded choke point, looked at Chinese traffic already moving through the system, and still chose to raise the pressure in the narrowest possible arena. That is not just escalation. That is escalation in a place where miscalculation has very little room to breathe. And now we come to China's problem. China is not at war with the United States. China has spent most of this conflict trying to benefit without crossing the threshold into direct military confrontation. It has positioned itself as a mediator when useful, a buyer when profitable, a quiet supporter when strategic, and a great power that can hover around the crisis without fully entering it. But a blockade that touches Chinese shipping is different because that is visible. A government can keep quiet about shadow finance, discrete oil purchases, back-channel diplomacy, and indirect leverage. It cannot quietly accept the public stopping, boarding, or seizure of its ships in the world. I think its most important energy corridor and pretend nothing happened. If China accepts that without response, the damage is not only commercial, it is reputational. Every state watching the US-China competition would immediately ask the same question. If China cannot protect commercial passage when its ships are already inside the choke point, what exactly does Chinese power amount to when the crisis becomes real? That is why the inside gate problem does not end with Washington's choices. It creates a second tree, China's response tree. China can back down and absorb humiliation. China can push harder and risk direct confrontation. Or China can choose the path it prefers most, using diplomatic pressure, third country messaging, market leverage, regional intermediaries, and carefully calibrated public warnings to raise the cost for America without firing a shot. That third path is the most likely, but even the most likely path is not clean, because diplomacy does not remove the ships from the water. Diplomacy does not erase the fact that a line has been declared and that two major powers now have public credibility attached to what happens next in the same narrow maritime corridor. That is the structure that makes this so dangerous, not inevitability. No one should pretend war between America and China is inevitable because of this morning. But there is a difference between saying war is inevitable and saying the structure now contains no easy exit, the structure now contains no easy exit. And the costs of that structure are not abstract, they are human, commercial, and regional. There are hundreds of tankers already caught in the wider Gulf system from the weeks of conflict and disruption. There are thousands upon thousands of sailors sitting in dangerous waters, waiting on decisions made far above them. Every extra layer of contestation in Hormuz worsens their exposure, not just militarily, but logistically, financially, psychologically. Then there is Iraq. Almost nobody talks about Iraq long enough in moments like this, but Iraq is exactly the kind of country that gets crushed when great powers turn a shipping lane into a strategic argument. Iraq depends overwhelmingly on Hormuz for food inflows and oil outflows. Iraq is not the author of this crisis. Iraq is one of its victims. That is what blockades do when they move from theory to reality. They rarely strike only the target. They spread stress outward through shipping, food, insurance, energy, politics, and fear. And that spread is already happening. Oil does not need to disappear entirely from the market for the world to feel pain. It only needs to become uncertain enough. The threat of friction is often enough. The possibility of delay is often enough. The sight of naval enforcement in a corridor this narrow is often enough. That is why the markets react before the shooting does. That is why states far from the fighting begin making phone calls. That is why Europe suddenly matters again in the story. Because when a blockade threatens to push oil higher, the diplomatic map widens immediately. Iran understands that. Its foreign minister moved quickly toward European capitals because once Hormuz becomes unstable again, this stops being only a Washington-Tehran argument. It becomes an energy argument, a coalition argument, a market argument, a pressure on allies argument. Europe needs energy stability. China needs oil flow. Russia benefits if America gets dragged deeper into Middle Eastern strain. Britain, notably, showed little appetite for embracing the American move in full. Each of those facts adds another layer to the same conclusion. The blockade was announced as a pressure instrument, but because Chinese ships were already inside the strait, and because the region is crowded with states that depend on passage, the pressure does not stay confined to Iran. It cascades outward. That is the right word here, cascade. And once a cascade begins in Hormuz, everybody starts calculating off everybody else. As calculations, Iran asks whether America really wants a broader confrontation. America asks whether China will publicly contest enforcement. China asks whether accepting inspection does more damage than resisting it. Europe asks how much oil pain it can bear. Regional states ask whether alignment with Washington now carries more risk than distance from it. The shipping industry asks whether legality matters less than survivability. And markets ask the only question they ever really ask in moments like this. How much worse can this get before anyone regains control? This is why I do not think the right way to read today is as a strong move that creates clarity. It creates the appearance of clarity, but underneath it creates a deeper fog, because clarity would mean that the line is enforceable without broader consequences. Clarity would mean China is not already in the frame. clarity would mean allies are aligned, negotiators are coordinated, and the target is isolated. That is not the reality here. China is in the frame. The allies are uneven. The diplomacy is unresolved, and the target is connected to too many external systems to stay isolated for long. That is what makes the inside gate problem so useful as a framework. It explains why the blockade feels forceful at the surface and unstable underneath. On television, a blockade can look like control. In reality, if the rival power's ships are already inside the gate, it may be the moment control becomes harder, not easier. And history is not especially kind to blockades. Once that happens, blockades almost always begin with confidence. They begin with the belief that pressure can be measured, directed, and contained. But once other powers, third-party economies, civilian shipping, and great power credibility are inside the mechanism, the original designers of the blockade no longer fully control the consequences. The pressure starts to travel. It hardens resistance. It internationalizes local disputes. It creates suffering in directions never advertised at the start. That does not mean blockades never work tactically. It means their political and strategic outcomes almost never stay as neat as their announcement language suggests. And that brings us back to the opening image. American warships enforcing a blockade, Chinese ships already inside the strait. That image matters because it strips away all the decorative language around the policy and shows you the real stakes immediately. This was not a clean starting gun. This was a late move in a crowded theater, a move made after China was already physically present in the corridor that now defines the crisis. So the question from here is not simply whether America can enforce a line. It is whether that line can now be enforced without turning a confrontation with Iran and a wider cost credibility with China, without pushing more regional states toward diplomatic hedging, without deepening energy instability, and without proving in the first hours of the blockade that enforcement itself is already constrained by who was in the water before the order took effect. That is the real story. The real story is not that America blockaded Hormuz. The real story is that America blockaded Hormuz after Chinese ships were already inside the strait. And in a choke point this narrow, with stakes this high, a blockade announced after the rival is already through the gate, is not a display of pure control. It is a wager that China will not push too hard, a wager that allies will not peel away, a wager that markets will not panic beyond what policymakers can manage, a wager that Iran will feel more pressure than opportunity, a wager that a narrow corridor can hold a very large confrontation without breaking. Maybe Washington believes all those wagers are still worth taking. Maybe it believes the alternatives were worse. Maybe it is right. But nobody should mistake the structure of this moment for something simple, because the moment those Chinese ships were already inside the strait. The blockade stopped being only about Iran. It became a test of whether American pressure can still organize the space after the other major power is already in the room. And if that test fails, even partially, what the world will remember is not merely that a blockade was declared. It will remember that when the gate closed, China was already inside. That is not the end of the story. That is the reason the story just became much bigger.